What is it about cars? Why do we love these inanimate objects? Why do we scour auction sites looking for dream rides? Why do we spend our weekends meeting up with others to look and talk about each other's cars? Why do we spend hours creating builds on manufacturers' websites? Cars should be about more than just getting from A to B. My mission with this podcast is to share more about our tribe. This is Danny P on Cars.
I would be nothing without you holding me up. Now I'm strong enough for both of us, both of us, both of us, both of us. I am a giant. Stand up on my shoulders. Tell me what you see. 'Cause I am a giant. We'll be breaking boulders underneath our feet.
Danny P on Cars was created to share stories of car people. There is always an exception to the rule, and Graeme is the first to admit he is not a car guy. So why is he on the podcast? Well, Graeme is a technology guy who is passionate about Formula One. So passionate that it's been his job since 1997. Graeme has spent over 20 years working in the world of Formula One, helping teams use technology for competitive advantage. Graeme joined the Benetton F1 team in 1997, a year and a half after they'd won the World Constructors' Championship. He helped the team transition to Renault ownership and win 2 World Championships. We talk drivers, racing and technical innovation. Graeme Hackland, welcome to Danny P on Cars.
Thank you, Dan, and thanks for getting it out there right up front. I am not a car guy.
I know you're not a car guy, but I appreciate you coming on a car podcast. It's
Thank you for the invite.
definitely testament to our friendship, so thank you very much for joining me.
I enjoy listening to the podcast and hearing all the car guys. So, yeah, they're going to have to listen. I suppose they don't have to listen to me, but yeah, let's see.
I think they will want to listen based on the content, and I know that the things that you've done and the things that you've seen. So it's going to be a great podcast. Let's kick things off just very quickly. Tell me about your first car, though. I know you had a love of your first car. So what was your first car?
So my first car was a 1963 Opel Kadett. I was living in South Africa. My parents bought it for me for my 21st birthday, and the car was older than I was, and I loved that car.
Yeah.
And I drove it until I didn't have enough money to fix it anymore, and then the mechanic who used to fix it, bought it off me. But yeah, I loved that car.
You spent a lot of time working in Formula One. How did you get your big break and secure a job in what is everyone's dream industry?
I never even thought about Formula One as a career choice. It just didn't occur to me that normal people like me worked in Formula One. Although once I got there, I realized, of course they do. That normal people like you and me, like everyone else, works in Formula One. It just wasn't on my horizon. Growing up in South Africa, you knew about Formula One. Jody Scheckter had been world champion, so it was a sport that was well covered, people were well aware of. So when I moved to England in 94, I was a Novell engineer. So for the IT people out there, they might remember Novell. And Benetton was sponsored by Novell. And a friend of mine knew the HP account manager at Benetton, who was asked by the IT manager there if he knew anyone who was a Novell engineer, because they were looking. And so it was just that word of mouth that got me an interview. And they offered it to me. And I was astonished. I remember standing in the kitchen with my wife and saying, Formula One on my CV. I said, right, I'll go do this for a couple of years, because we weren't long in the country, 3 years in the country. And I thought, we'll do this for a couple of years and then get F1 on my CV, and then I'll go get a proper job. And like you said, I ended up 25 years in Formula One before I left the sport last year.
Yeah, that's super cool. It's amazing how you plan for something short term and it becomes a long term thing.
I love being part of a team. Every company talks about team, right? But actually working in sport in a sporting team is different. And I loved that every single person knew what part they were playing to help the team go racing. And I just loved that. And yeah, ended up staying for a very long time.
When you can see the results of your work very quickly and the contributions you'll make, it's very easy to make that link between working and seeing the on-track performance, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. That narrow focus, I used to talk about it a lot when I was working in Formula One. That narrow focus of getting two cars around a track 20, 21, 23 times a year, however many races they end up with, was just brilliant. And when you're doing well, and that only happened to me a few seasons, it's amazing. When you're not doing well, and that happened to me more seasons than I care to remember, including one pointless season when I was at Williams. Yeah, that's hard then to keep. How do you keep yourselves motivated when you're at the back of the grid and probably not going to score a point for the next race and the next race, and then a whole season goes by? So yeah, it's a great sport for that immediacy of your performance directly translated to track performance. But if the track performance is no good and you're still working as hard as ever, that's really tough.
I can imagine. So you joined Benetton after they had quite recently won a world championship. What was it like joining the team at that time?
Yeah, Benetton had won with Michael Schumacher, 94, 95, I think it was. And then he'd gone off to Ferrari and actually had taken quite a lot of the engineering with him. Some of the key engineering design staff had gone to Ferrari with him. And they built that team around him there. But I loved it. I mean, I loved being part of that team. The teams were fairly small back then. I mean, less than 200 people. You knew everyone. There was only 3 people working in IT, plus the IT manager. When I got to Benetton, it was small. It felt like a family. It really did. I think that the difficulty was they needed to rebuild, but the Benetton family didn't have the level of funding that started to become necessary in the late 90s when big motor manufacturers were coming in, big funded teams. The Benetton family couldn't fund it to that level.
Your role included being trackside. Can you remember those early trackside experiences?
Yeah, I mean, mostly my job was factory based. As the teams got bigger, as they became more reliant on data, as data became bigger. When I first joined, you could get the data from 2 cars from a race weekend onto a floppy disk, so just over 1 meg for those who know what that is. So in today's terms, that was tiny. I mean, you're generating more than that before you get to the first corner, before you launch actually. So, but data grew and exploded to where even DVDs weren't big enough, and eventually it was all disk based because there's so much data. And so I really enjoyed those early trackside experiences, except for winter testing. Winter testing was always soul destroying because they'd run 2 cars all day, doing two race distances per car, and then they'd strip the cars overnight, completely rebuild them. We didn't have day shifts and night shifts, so everybody just worked. So I remember one evening having dinner and thinking I've still got another 8 hours to go. You'd get 4 or 5 hours sleep and you'd be back at the track. But it was great. We all felt like you were a very close team. We were testing new systems and software that they were deploying and making sure that it was all working. And sometimes we dragged the software developer out to a test somewhere, sometimes at Silverstone in the freezing cold in the winter, to come and test the software. Most of the testing took place in Barcelona because you were hoping you were going to get good weather, although I remember quite a few snowy test days in Barcelona in the winter, and sometimes at Paul Ricard in the south of France. So those are typically the places we went, and we were testing so much. When I think about how much it's restricted now, how little testing Formula One does, it makes you realize that we probably didn't actually have to do as much as we did back then. But yeah, the idea was to run all day, rebuild the car overnight, run all the next day, rebuild the car, and they did that for 5 days, and it was mad. And by the time you left the circuit, you were exhausted and you needed days to sleep. I remember it being great fun, great camaraderie. You really felt like a team. My first race, I remember, was the year after I joined. So it was Hungary in 1998. When the team arrived in Budapest, the Novell server had failed. experience. So I got sent over with a Novell server under my arm, flew in, replaced the server, made sure it was working the next morning. I sat in the hotel. They phoned me and said, yes, it's working. And I went to the airport and flew back home. So I never actually got to see or hear the cars run, because back then it was very difficult for them to get anybody to the track who wasn't part of the test team. Couldn't get passes and whatever. So yeah, that was my first experience of the track, not actually hearing or seeing the cars, but making sure that they could run for the rest of that test.
So there was a lot of testing going on back then, but presumably now some of that's been replaced with simulations and computational stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. But they've put, by regulation, they've put limits on the amount of wind tunnel time you can have, and how much supercompute you can use. So how many clock cycles you can have in an 8-week period. There's a lot of restrictions. So you, just so that the teams didn't swap physical testing at a track with, the bigger funded teams would have been able to buy the biggest supercomputers in the world. I remember the one that we implemented at Renault was actually in the top 500 in the world. It was one of the biggest in Formula One. And soon after that, they brought all the limits in and limited how many teraflops you can have. And those regulations have been refined over the years. But yeah, it is now largely about simulation, very little track testing. And during the season, almost nothing. You get a few straight line aero tests sometimes, but very little track testing, except on the Friday. Those 2 practice sessions on a Friday are critical for trying anything. Usually the first one, you're trying something new. The second one is is the same time usually as qualifying in the race. So you're trying to do your setups then. So you're not really, so that first practice session of a Grand Prix, you shouldn't worry too much about the times. Usually people are testing new parts, new configurations, new software, new parts on the car. So I think it was mad the way things used to be. I remember a few years where we had qualifying engine, so an engine that was lightweight, only lasted 12 laps, and then was never used again. And you had an engine on the Friday, qualifying engine on Saturday, and a different race engine on the Sunday. So overnight on a Saturday after qualifying, they'd completely rebuild the cars with the race engine. So yeah, it was mad. I quite like where we are now, where the engine has to last multiple races, the gearboxes do. I think that's much more sustainable.
It's interesting because back then it was literally how big's your checkbook, and how can you if you're having to buy new engines and deliver different engines every weekend and stuff. Now at least there's sustainability, and then there's this the cost cap that means that you can't just buy a world championship.
They've tried to level the playing field. We'll see whether it works. I think we'll only know in the next couple of years if the cost cap is going to work. It's going to take a few years for the advantage that the big teams had to unwind itself. But the teams with the more money will have more money. In the past, if teams had got their car wrong, they'd develop a new one. I remember a few years at Renault, we had a chief designer for this year's car and a chief designer for next year's car. And they had design teams running in parallel. So you ended up with almost 12 months of development rather than 4 to 6 months as was typical. So yeah, the more money you had, I know that Honda were running 3 wind tunnels at one time. The year before it became BAR, they were running 3 wind tunnel programs. So it was amazing the amount of money that was spent on chasing that small amount of performance. And now they do it largely with simulation, and it's about efficiency now rather than just consuming vast amount of resources.
Drivers early on, so the team had John Alesi when you joined, which was a teammate of one of my previous guests, Dominic Dobson, who raced Porsches at Le Mans with him. Dominic painted him as a true European racer who may have ignored the rules a little to get the best lap times. Any stories about the early drivers that you worked with?
Yeah, in 97, I joined in the May of 97, and Alesi and Berger were in their second year with the team. They weren't happy with the team, so I didn't get to see the best of those two. They were coming towards the end of their careers, so I don't have good memories. A lot of whining and moaning. I know that's a terrible thing to say. I mean, racers, they wore their hearts on their sleeves. They were just disappointed in the performance of the team and the car. We won a race that year. I mean, my first race with the team, I think it was about my 6th race in Germany. I never got to see the best of them, so I didn't have a great opinion of them I know Berger was ill for a few races and Alex Wirtz stepped in. I really liked Alex. He was a test driver and then obviously got these few races as the race driver. I thought he was great. And we finished third in the championship that year. So it wasn't that bad a season. But despite that, the overriding memory I have of Alesi and Berger is just a lot of moaning at the team.
Wanting them to do better.
Yeah.
Got it. Early on, Renault take over the team and invest. Do you remember that time and what it was like? And were there rumours in advance of them taking over? What was going on at the time?
Yeah, so I've mentioned 97. 98 was Fisichella and Wirtz. Fisichella, I love Fisichella. I thought he was a fantastic team player. He was a really good driver. He was very popular in the team. We had many seasons with him, and I think he was fantastic for the team, for development of the car as a racing driver with the sponsors. He was just superb. But the team was slipping down the championship. So by 98, 5th in the championship, 99, 6th in the championship. 2000 got a little bit of a bump because Fissy got a few podiums and I think ended 4th that year. 2001, Button joined the team. So it had Fisichella and Button. But it was an awful year with reliability. But it had been announced in 2000 that the team was selling to Renault, which was a surprise because I know that, I think it was in 99, Dave Richards had come to run the team and he'd said to the Benetton family, an independent is not going to be able to compete. You need to consider selling to to an automotive, suggested Ford, or they were looking at options, and the Benetton family had said, no, we're not going to sell. We're going to remain as a family team. I think reality really came along, and so then they announced. So we hadn't heard anything inside the team. We didn't know that it was going to be sold, but once that was announced, that did put a lot of minds at rest that the team had a future, because there was a worry as we were sliding down the grid and money was running out. So I remember going to see the CFO, and he had two proposals on his desk, one for a new brake system and one for a new server. He said, I can only afford one of these. So I said, well, we can live with the server for a few more years. Let's go for the brakes. It was literally like that, where you were making decisions about either car parts or other things. So every penny you spent was literally being taken from the car. And that wasn't sustainable. So it did worry people. And then the news about Renault buying came, and that just settled everything. They cleverly decided to run as Benetton for another year and a half after that, because the team was still in decline. I remember 2001, the last year as Benetton, just being awful. The cars were so unreliable. Finished 7th in the championship, the worst I'd experienced in my career up to that point. But there was no concern within the team. Inside the team, it was all calm, because we knew that Renault were already investing through 2002, the end of 2000 and 2001. They'd been investing significant amount of money into the team. We doubled the size of our staff during that 2000-2001 period. We were in the process of completely refreshing our entire technology stack, not just IT, but for electronics, in the wind tunnel, everything. They asked us what we needed to win the World Championship in 5 years, and then they gave us the funding to go do it. In 2002, when we ran as Renault for the first time, it was with Button and Trulli. Unfortunately, Giancarlo didn't get to stay and experience that, but he does feature later. There were still lots of reliability issues that year, but we finished 4th in the championship. So inside the team, we felt really good about that. We could see that we were starting to turn things around. I thought 5 years was probably really ambitious in terms of winning the championship, because we'd only won 2 or 3 races in my time before Renault, 2 races, I think, before Renault. So that I thought, how are we going to win a world championship in 5 years? But we just worked night and day. It was incredible to watch that. What was a small team of 200 people become 400 in 18 months, and absolutely everything: new computers, new servers, new networks, the internet links upgraded so that you didn't have to wait overnight for things to be copied from the track back to the factory. So it just revolutionized how the engineers were working. It was fantastic to watch. 2003 was Trulli, and then Fernando. Fernando had been our test driver in 2002, the first year as Renault. And inside the team, you talk to any of the engineers, anyone who worked with them. The test drivers back then did a lot of testing, a lot of track testing, a lot of testing in the simulators. he was the real deal. Everyone could feel that, even in his testing role, you could see he was on it. So he got the position in 2003 to go racing, and he actually won a race that year. So my seventh year in Formula One, I think that was about the second or third win. Finished again fourth in the championship that year, but it just felt like there was this whole positiveness around the team. 2004, Trulli and Alonso again. Things went wrong with Trulli, went wrong between him and Flavio Briatore. There were quite a few reliability issues the year before, but that year, most of them were resolved. The car was reliable. That was really nice to see. 2004, Ferrari won 15 of the 18 races. I mean, they dominated. We were on track, Renault were on track to finish second that season, but got beaten by BAR. I think some of the blame for that was put on the shoulders, fairly or unfairly, I don't know, but on the shoulders of Trulli, who was eventually fired during that season by Flavio. Largely because in France, which was obviously the home race for Renault, we were on for a double podium. For whatever reason, Jarno didn't get the podium. I'm not gonna go any further. I don't want you getting sued, in your podcast, and I don't want to be sued. But yeah, there was a lot of speculation about what happened there. So he was gone. Jacques Villeneuve came in for 3 races, but didn't score any points. That didn't go well. So 2004 ended in a very odd way, with a driver being fired, another driver coming in, not doing so well. Fernando doing pretty well, and we felt positive. And then Fisichella came back for 2005. That pairing of Alonso and Fisichella, I really liked that. And I know you haven't asked a question for a while, but let me touch on 2005. So we go into the first race, had a really good winter test. Winter testing was always tricky. Some teams were, sandbagging, never showed their true potential. But we felt, the car seemed stable. The drivers liked it. We went into that season quite positive. I remember McLaren were really strong in 2005, although they suffered with reliability issues, which is ultimately why they were champions. Fisichella won the first race in Australia, which was fantastic. Fernando won the next 3. So suddenly we'd won 4 races in a single season, which was just blowing my mind. So we had a car that was capable of winning every race. It didn't. It won 8. Fernando winning 7, and Giancarlo won. Fernando was on the podium 15 of the 19 races that season. It was amazing. It was one of the 2 highlights of my entire career. Maybe 3 highlights if I consider my first year at Williams. It was amazing. Absolutely amazing. It was the last of the V10 era as well. So for those listeners who loved that noise, you'd stand in the back of the garage and your ears would bleed if you weren't wearing ear defenders. Those cars were incredible. And unfortunately, that was also the season where we had that infamous US Grand Prix, which some of your listeners will remember, where all the Michelin tired cars had to withdraw. So although McLaren got more wins than Renault, they were way less reliable, and so we were world champions. What a feeling that was. Then we went into 2006, Fernando announcing that he was leaving at the end of that season to go to McLaren. We were gutted. Yeah, he told us that he was on a podium where he'd finished second and McLaren had finished first, and he had a chat with Ron Dennis while they were standing on the podium. And they'd almost come to a deal while they were standing up on the podium for him to go race for Ron in 2007. So we started 2006 knowing we were losing Alonso the next year, which was pretty annoying. But Alonso and Fisichella again, champions again, possibly the favorite of the 2. I mean, the first, you never forget your first. You all know. But that was a bit of a suspect McLaren that regularly broke down. In 2006, you had Michael Schumacher in a Ferrari at their best, and it went all the way to the end of the season, and we ended up beating them by just 5 points. And it was an amazing year. That's what I remember about those early years.
Wow, what a great set of years, and at the end, leading that up to 2 world championships. How did the team celebrate after a world championship? Was there anything special that went on for the team?
Oh yeah, Renault were brilliant. Renault absolutely wanted to celebrate. So the end of 2005 was extraordinary. They hired Blenheim Palace, which if your listeners in the US might not know this, but it's where near where Winston Churchill was born. There, the Duke of Marlborough owns it. Hired Blenheim Palace. Our colleagues from France who were at Viry-Châtillon on the engine factory came over, and we all celebrated together as one team. and Fernando drove the car up to the steps of Black Palace. It was incredible. Then we came back that night with our partners, and we had an amazing party. So yes, Renault were very good at celebrating championships.
Very cool. And then the second World Championship, probably more significant because of the competitiveness of the Ferraris, etc. Technology played quite a key role in that year, didn't it, in terms of the car technology?
There was a lot of innovation back then. There was a lot you could change. I think it's a bit more restricted now, partly to keep the regulations down. Although there's still, you look every year, somebody finds something that the other teams didn't think of, and they all try and copy it. So it still happens. And I think Formula One's always been like that. Those early 2000 years was particularly when there was a huge amount of innovation. And there was you're right. There was a particularly clever piece of innovation that Renault had called the tune mass damper. And it was basically a little spring inside the nose of the car that just introduced great stability as the car was going over the curbs. So you could ride the curbs. They didn't have the track limits back then. Got on board with track limits now. But you could ride the curbs, and it would just keep the car really stable. And the idea, I think, came from buildings, mainly over where you live. Buildings are often in an earthquake zone. Many of them, as I learned back then, are actually mounted on springs to make sure that they don't fall over in an earthquake. And it was that same, that they called it harmonic absorbers. So it absorbed a lot of the frequency that you would get from the car bouncing around. We'd run it at the end of 2005, and back then, and I'm pretty sure now, before you put anything on your car, you check it with the FIA that it. And they won't say to you that, yes, this is legal, or they'll say, we don't believe the stewards would have any reason to find this illegal. They're always very careful about how they say it. But if they say that, it's almost always okay. And so everything had been shared with them, the drawings, everything. So we ran that in the car in 2005. The other teams couldn't work out what we were doing. And I think one of them must have hired someone from because that's what happens. People move between the teams. They must have hired someone who'd worked on that project, because the other teams found out about it and tried to copy it. So the two things you do in Formula One when you find out about what another team's doing, you try to copy it, and then you try to get the FIA to ban it. That's the two avenues you go down. So they were successful, whoever it was. It was successful in getting it banned. So in the middle of 2006, having run it for the first half of the year, we had to take it off the car from one race to the next. Just take it off the car. So we have a pretty good idea of how much time it was giving us. It was about 0.3 of a second per lap, which is significant. But just that funny, clever little concept of sticking what we nicknamed Zebedee, a little spring in the nose of the car, genius. But there was so much technology innovation going on, and that's the bit I loved about Formula One, just pushing those regulations to the limits, and that's what the tune mass damper did.
Project Zebedee, I love it. So the teams that you've worked with, regardless of ownership, had a reputation for smart people behind the scenes, developing the cars, looking at the rule books, seeing where they could find competitive advantage. Can you talk about any of those folks that you worked with specifically?
I often got to work with the smartest engineers. They'd be challenging us, challenging the technology we're providing. It wasn't fast enough. It was never fast enough. The software was never deployed quick enough. And so I got to work with them and understand what their challenges were and how we were going to tackle those challenges and how we were going to try and get to the front of the grid by finding a competitive advantage that the other teams didn't have. So, especially in those early Renault days that I've just talked through, Renault really put together strong engineering teams. And the next time I saw that happen was really Ferrari around Schumacher, when they brought a whole load of the really strong teams together. Red Bull did it for a while. Each of those championship winning teams, if you have a look, it's never just that one technical director. There's a group of really strong technical people, and Mercedes did it really well. They had about 5 former technical directors from other teams all come and own a part of the technology of the car, and that's when they first started with Lewis winning championships, they built that really strong technical team. And I was lucky enough to work for some of the best in Formula One with Pat Simmons, Bob Bell. Bob, I don't think gets enough credit for what he does. He's super smart. One of the smartest people I ever worked with in Formula One, but never wanted the limelight, so was never pushed himself forward. But yeah, Bob is brilliant. Still involved in some ways. in Enstone. James Ellison, who's at Mercedes, I worked with him a couple of times. He obviously went to Ferrari. James, super smart as well. Dino Toso, who was our head of aero in those late 90s, early 2000s. And sadly, Dino passed away, had cancer and passed away. But he instilled in a lot of the people who went on to lead aero at Enstone what it took to build a strong team, that no-blame culture, that work ethic that they had. A lot of that was driven by Dino Toso. Nick Worth, worked with him, again, super smart, still building all sorts of incredible technology now outside of Formula One. And so many more that you won't have heard of. And that's the thing. I think about a lot of these technical folk. They don't go after the limelight. They're just super smart at what they do. We had engineers from Nissan come over and work with us, as part of the Renault-Nissan Alliance, and work on the electronics. And we had some of the best electronics engineers. The launch control that Renault had back when that was a thing was one of the best in the grid. We would overtake 1, 2, maybe 3 people if we got it right every race with the launch control system that they had. And obviously now it's all back in the driver's hands, not in the technology. But that was incredible. And most of those people you'll have never heard of. That's what I take most from my time in Formula One, is the super smart, dedicated people, focused, hardworking. Their work ethic is incredible. And that focus on excellence, but knowing you need to do it at pace. Being a perfectionist in Formula One, you'll be at the back of the grid. It's getting the best possible outcome as quickly as possible. And then whatever that is, iterating on top of it. So race by race by race, you're improving. You don't bring a huge package of improvements to the car in race 6. If you can bring something to the car every single race, you do it. So yeah, I learned a lot from a lot of these smart engineers.
That sounds super cool. And Bob Bell, I had the privilege of interviewing a few years ago, specifically, and he was the first aerodynamicist for McLaren. So got to work with the likes of Senna and Prost at an early time when Formula One was looking into aerodynamics, and his kind of aspirations were aviation, and that obviously changed, and he moved into Formula One. And so many of those other names are legendary in the sport, and you're right, they don't look for the limelight, they just look to get the job done and have an impact that way.
Yeah, I should mention Patrick Head as well. Although when I got to Williams, he'd already retired, so I didn't get to work with him. But in his day, fostering that innovation, finding the right team of people, really pushing the boundaries of the regulations and the technology. And he was another one who comes to mind when you think about the smartest engineers in F1.
Clearly, there's been a lot of innovation in the last 20 years, but you progressed through the ranks to become head of IT and overall director of the IS IT group. What were the significant innovations that you and your team worked on?
For us, it was about reliability of the systems. When they were trackside from Thursday, we'd always say from Wednesday night, but in reality, you could get away with from Thursday morning until whenever they shut it down on the Sunday night. Everything had to run 100% of the time. And especially in the early days, you were in Grand Prix circuits in the middle of nowhere where power, may or may not have been reliable. It was often difficult to keep those services running. But that's what we focused on, reliability. They had to be able to get access to the systems. And then it was about performance of those systems. So the software, the development of the software we put a lot of focus into how engineers think. How do we make sure that they get the right information at the right time? If you look at all the channels of data that are coming off a Formula One car, there's way too much for any one engineer to absorb, right? Except for performance engineers. I remember one of the best, Rod Nelson, that I worked with. He could look at both cars' data, all the data from both cars, and process it in his brain. It was incredible. But most engineers would be looking at a subset of the data, and our job was to write those UIs, create those applications that would allow them to see what they needed to see at the right time. And we didn't do that because we were clever. We did it in partnership with them, making sure we were delivering what they needed. When I joined Benetton all that time back, they had a couple of CompuServe accounts for email, so not everyone had email. I used to print off memos and put them on the engineers' desks ahead of the race to let them know what systems we would have at the track. The innovation's been incredible, all the way up to the pandemic. I don't think any podcast can happen these days without a mention of the pandemic. But if the pandemic had happened 10 years before, you would not have been able to do any Formula One work remote from the site. Everything was done, on premise. But when the pandemic hit, all we had to do was scale what was there. We'd already had in place and made it possible for designers, CAD designers, to work from home, to do CAD design from home, safely, securely, with the right performance, with the right, that the graphics were right. That was incredible. So being able to scale that so everybody could work from home was amazing. I don't underestimate what an effort that took for a CAD designer, especially to be able to work from home and be we designed a car largely from home. That's amazing. But a lot of the innovation from an IT perspective was around the applications. Can you buy it off the shelf? And will it do 80-90% of what you need to do? Then just buy it off the shelf. That's probably the cheapest option. If you need to develop it yourself, how can you make sure that you're working in a very agile way so that you're constantly, every race, giving them updates? So they've got new features every single race. So we put that in place rather than waterfall where you do 3, 4, 5 drops of software a year. We were deploying features every single race. And then it was just about the performance of the infrastructure, making sure that they had the storage work that... Yeah, if you could get data to your engineer a second quicker than the other teams, you were probably going to get some places in a race. Now, I saw a number of times, Monaco, I remember Mercedes calling Hamilton in for a so-called free pit stop and him ending up in third place instead of winning the race because their data had a 6-second lag in it that they hadn't spotted. And that kind of thing happened, and you had to be on top of that. You had to know where the issues were. So we built into our software that there was that latency at Monaco. There isn't now. They got receivers all over the track. But back then, you had delays in the data. So with that constant innovation around data, getting it into the right hands at the right time so they could make the right decision. When I first got into the sport, you had 10 seconds to make a decision. Now they need to make decisions in a second. Not quite sub-second yet, unless you're just about to pass the pit lane and you want to call the driver in. And that's where, we're looking at things, they are looking at things like artificial intelligence and how you can get to give the humans the data they need even more quickly than we have been able to in the past.
Yeah, it goes back to this theme that everyone in the factory, IT, aero, everyone is playing their part to produce results on the track, isn't it?
Absolutely, because you don't have the money, especially now with the cost cap that you mentioned earlier. You don't have the money to have anyone working for you who's not contributing to car performance or reliability. You just don't. There's no luxury now. There was lots of technology I'd love to have a play with, but we just didn't have the time. We had to be super focused.
So if you look at the sport from the outside looking in, it appears to be very glamorous. Did you, working in the IT team, see any side of that glamour?
Largely for the people who worked in Formula One, there was very little of the glamour, right? I talked a little bit about winter testing earlier. There was no glamour at 15, 18-hour days. The most, I suppose the most glamorous I ever got to experience, or the most glamour I ever got to experience was Monaco. I remember doing Monaco 5 years in a row, running cables from the garage down through the harbour to because it sounds glamorous. Oh, it really wasn't. But what was glamorous was all the beautiful people who were there that you got to see, or who walked down the pit lane or came into your garage. And also in Monaco, I remember Flavio Briatore inviting all of the team onto his boat for drinks. So that was a bit glamorous. That was pretty cool. Red Bull used to invite all of the team's personnel, not just their own team, to come onto their hospitality station for drinks one of the evenings. I can't remember if it was the day before running, so it might have been tactical that they wanted everyone to be drinking there the night before the race. I don't think so. I think it was Thursday night. So, Monaco, you don't run on a Friday, you run on a Thursday. I think it was Thursday night they used to invite the teams. So that was pretty cool. Got to do that. I saw we haven't really talked about cars much. I did once see a Ferrari Enzo in Monaco. That was a beautiful car. And just parked at the side of the harbour. That was pretty cool. I saw lots of celebrities, and celebrities I've never really been that bothered with celebrity. But I did meet Frank Bruno once at the British Grand Prix, and I actually asked him if I could have a photo with him, and I was a little starstruck. And I walked down to the podium at the end of the race with him. Dozens and dozens of people stopped him, said hello. He said hello back, asked for photos or just a high five. What a lovely, lovely man. So that's one of the few times I've enjoyed the the glamorous side of Formula One.
Well, what a gentleman. And for those not familiar with Frank, just he's a national British treasure who was a boxer who fought Mike Tyson. What a great legend. What a great legend. So where did your career go after? So the team won the World Championship for the second time in 2006, which was the last time they would win a World Championship. The team changed hands a couple of times, and but where did your career go after that kind of peak of the second World Championship?
I stayed at Enstone through the end of Renault's time. You might remember a couple of scandals that happened in the sport around 2008, 2009. I was there for those, and Renault sold the team. Again, not wanting either of us to get sued, I'll be careful about what I say, but the people who bought the team were not my kind of people. So I decided it was time to get out of Formula One, and I'd spent 16 and a half years in the sport, and I thought, that's it. I'm not going to another team. I'm gonna go do something else. And I started looking for a job outside of Formula One. It's hard to find something that was going to excite me as much of that, but I just felt like I've had enough. I'm not going to go to another team. And I got a call to say Williams were looking for a CIO. They'd created the CIO role. They wanted their first CIO. Would I be interested? Now, I started watching Formula One in the 80s with two friends in college, one of whom was a Senna fan, one of whom was a Prost fan. And so they told me as the Brit I had to be a Mansell fan. I didn't know anything about the sport or anything. And that's where I started watching. So Mansell in a Williams just caught my imagination seeing. And I think the first race I watched was the British Grand Prix, where thousands of fans poured onto the track, surrounded Nigel's car, and he got out of the car holding the Union flag, and oh man, that was it. I've watched it ever since, and I've heard Nigel interviewed about that particular race, and he said he was shouting to everyone because people were starting to try and take bits off his car. He said, if anyone touches this car, I will lose the race win. And so a group of fans surrounded the car.
Wow.
Wouldn't let anyone else near it, or he wouldn't have passed the scrutineering. So that was quite incredible. So this opportunity to join Williams, and I admired Sir Frank Williams for a long time. And he came back from his car accident that paralyzed him, to take the team back to winning world championships. He was an incredible man. We talked a little bit about glamour or heroes. We didn't quite talk about heroes, but Sir Frank was a hero of mine. So that's the only time I've ever been nervous going to an interview was when I met Sir Frank Williams. I actually had the job already by the time I met him because he'd stepped out from the day-to-day running and handed it over to Claire Williams.
Why don't we take a break here, and we'll be right back to hear about Graeme's interview process with the Williams team. This is Danny P on Cars. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Danny P on Cars. I'm with Graeme Hackland, and we've been talking about winning world championships with the Benetton team. The less than glamorous side of spending 18 hours at the track in the snow in Barcelona, and a few other great things. But for the second half, we wanted to kick things off where Graeme leaves what was the Benetton and then became the Lotus team, and gets the opportunity to interview at the Williams team. And for those that are not familiar with the Williams team, it was one of the last teams on the track that was privately owned. It was spearheaded by Sir Frank Williams, who started the team in the late 70s and had lots of success. So Graeme, you get the opportunity to interview at Williams. What was that all about?
That was amazing. I'd been interviewing, and no disrespect intended, but I'd been interviewing at banks and normal companies and trying to find a passion for whatever my next gig was going to be. And then this opportunity came up to go to Williams. So I arrived at the gates, having never been there before. I was still an employee of another Formula One team. So I was on the gate as a confidential visitor. I said, hi, I'm Graeme. I'm a confidential visitor. Oh, yes, you need to drive over. Went off into the conference center, hoping I wasn't going to see anyone I knew, and I didn't, fortunately. And then almost the entire executive came filing into this room, in ones or twos, and interviewed me for hours and hours and hours. And it was pretty intense. And I also get to meet Craig Wilson, who ran Williams Advanced Engineering. because that was another thing that really interested me in Williams. I kind of felt like I was done with Formula One. I didn't really want to go into another Formula One team, although I learned once I joined Williams that actually I still loved Formula One, and I was really pleased to be there. But it was Williams Advanced Engineering that really interested me. They were taking the technology they used in Formula One and applying it to all sorts of other industries. Battery technology that came out of, the KERS, the kinetic energy recovery systems that then got used in Formula E, the electric formula, and in road cars and in bicycles and in motorbikes, and carbon fiber being used to protect babies in hospitals, and all sorts of really interesting applications for Formula One technology. And I loved that. And I was on their investment board for a while, and that was pretty cool. But yeah, sitting in that room, I left there after hours and hours and hours, got home and said to my wife, I'm not sure how that went. However, Mike O'Driscoll, who was the CEO, was the last one into the room. And I'd said to my wife, if they offer it, I mean, they're unlikely to, but if they do, I'll probably accept, because I like the sound of everything. But it depends, what they say to me during that day. And so, the final interview, Mike offered me the job right there and then on the day. And so I accepted it. So I went home telling Man that, I don't know how it went. And then I said to her, but I got offered the job and I accepted it. It was that quick. And yeah, leaving Instone was really hard. I mean, Benetton, you twice avoided mentioning Renault there. And when you introduced us coming back, it was Renault that I won the World Championships with. It was Renault that, I will have my love forever for what they did for that team. Saved Benetton, won World Championships, stuck with us through all the tough times, and eventually when they had to step out of the sport, tried to put us in the hands of what they thought would be good owners, and then came back to rescue the team again when things weren't going well. So I have a lot of love for Renault. Yeah. I hadn't wanted to leave. It was really hard to leave there. But once I arrived at Williams, seeing Sir Frank, he was in the factory every day. He was often at reception. He would be in the factory floor in the night shift, talking to the night shift, still setting those standards, even though his daughter Claire Williams had taken over the day-to-day running of the team. I loved that he was there. I had a number of meetings with him. My first meeting with him, he said, I don't know anything about IT, and then went on to prove over the next 45 minutes that he actually knew a lot about IT in terms of sponsorship, right? So he set up the team with Patrick Head. Frank was the money man, Patrick was the engineer, and the two of them just worked brilliantly together and won all those championships. Yeah, we started talking about, because in the museum at Williams, if you look at all the cars, there are so many tech companies on those cars. So Frank knew a lot about technology companies, and he was asking me about who I was interested in bringing to the team. So that was part of my role as CIO, was to go and find tech sponsors to come and help us win the World Championship, which was the target. Unfortunately, we never did achieve that. In fact, never won a race in my time with Williams, which I will always regret. Although it wasn't my fault that few opportunities we had, we didn't win. Although as a team, you win together and you lose together. But yeah, it was incredible to see Sir Frank every day in the factory, to be part of Claire's executive, working on sponsorship deals. I worked on quite a few sponsorship deals with Claire. She was brilliant at talking to these, CEOs of major organizations about this family team, and did they want to come and be part of the family, and did they want to come and help the team? And when they joined, she made them feel part of the family. It was brilliant.
Yeah. And for those not familiar with the Advanced Engineering Group, you mentioned the Formula E battery supplier, etc. But they did some other cool stuff, didn't they? They developed a Bond car.
Oh yes, they did. Also, one of my favorite projects that we did. So the Spectre, the film Spectre, it's not actually the Bond car, because that's obviously the Aston Martin, but it was the baddie car. So when Dave Bautista drives out of the gates of Blenheim Palace onto the streets of Rome, which is hilarious for those of us who live near Blenheim Palace, that car that he's in, that copper-coloured car that he chases Bond with, was created by Williams Advanced Engineering. And it was amazing. And some of our staff travelled with the film crew, because obviously they couldn't afford any downtime when they film. They've closed the streets of Rome to go filming. You can't have any downtime. And so some of the team travelled with them. And yeah, it was brilliant to see that car that we had worked with Jaguar on.
And if those want to search for the car, it's the Jaguar. Well, that's Jaguar C-X75.
CX-75. That's it.
That's the car.
And they modified so the CX-75 was the very first project that actually established Williams Advanced Engineering as a separate organization from F1. Jaguar had come to Williams and were looking for some assistance around building that car, lightweight materials, electrification, that kind of thing. That was an awesome car, but it was a £1 million supercar, so you weren't going to drive that down the steps in Rome. It wasn't a stunt car. So some specific versions of that were made. I think they made 5 for the film. It was a more rugged body, but it looked exactly the same as the CX-75. Yeah, that was an incredible car.
Yeah. And the other thing I remember them for, as in the engineering group, is they developed the engine for the relatively new Singer DLS. So I can remember being with you one time going around the factory, and there were 2 or 3 of the mule cars in the factory area being developed on, which was another cool project.
I knew we'd eventually get to Porsche, and I'd have to confess that I don't actually like Porsches, but I don't want to go there because I know how much you love them. So yeah, they did do that project. Again, lightweighting. So taking a car apart, weighing everything, looking at what's needed from an engineering point of view, making sure that the strength is in the right places, and using lightweight materials. They did that for another number of projects, including a boat. So they set the fastest time for an electric boat with Jaguar. Yeah, all sorts of projects like that. They're working with airlines on how to make the cabin, like the overhead bins where you put your luggage, make those really lightweight, but they have to be strong too, because we tend to put very heavy bags in there. So yeah, lots and lots of interesting projects that Williams Advanced Engineering were doing. They were sold a little while ago. They developed that same battery. This is what I find fascinating. The same battery technology that was used in a Formula One car, basically to take energy from braking and from heat from the engine, and give the driver a boost button that they could press, was then used in, I mentioned bicycles with Brompton, motorbikes with Harley Davidson, road cars with Jaguar, and some Land Rovers, boat with Jaguar, and then massive mining trucks in Australia. These trucks that are taking tons and tons of earthworks and moving it around a site. They created the electrical systems and battery systems that could turn those from fuel vehicles that, when they're underground, obviously that's really dangerous, to electric vehicles. Amazing. And so they were bought out by one of those companies.
Very, very cool. Before we go to a quick fire round, I was going to ask you very quickly about a couple of things. And you can plead the fifth, as we would say in the US, on these, and we can cut this out if it's not appropriate. But in the late 2000s, the McLaren team received the largest fine ever in a sport for what was known as Spygate. Obviously, you were at a competitive team at the time. Any reflections on, what was happening and what you were hearing when you were at your team and Ferrari and McLaren were kind of exchanging secrets?
That was incredible. In all my time in Formula One before Spygate, you knew that engineers moved teams. I mentioned that earlier. And they would take, if it was a designer, they'd take some drawings with them. Or if they were an engineer, they'd take some documents that they created. They always had this feeling of they owned, like they wrongly, they felt they owned this. And so they'd arrive at their new team, they'd show their new team the data they brought with them, and the team would use it or not use it. And that was common practice, I would say, in the late 90s when I first came into Formula One. And it had kind of almost died away a bit. So the exchange of information that was happening between those two teams was incredible. Everything, car design, strategy data that was being used in simulators, that had not been seen in Formula One before. And in fact, the team I was with also got caught up in this whole Spygate. An engineer who'd come from McLaren to us had brought 8 files with them. Someone had, not in IT, I hasten to add, had copied them onto the network for them. And so, we had another team's data on our network. And that really focused our mind on, we'd all been looking at systems around, data loss prevention, making sure that your data couldn't go out. And we'd spend all our time looking at our data and trying to make sure that our data didn't leave our systems. And we hadn't thought about what the impact would be of someone else's data coming in. Could have been really impactful. So we were completely open with the FIA on what had happened and were able to prove it. So we did a forensic investigation. We had a forensic company come in and show that these files had never been printed, copied around the network, emailed, they'd not been widely used. And I think that happened to a number of teams where that practice of just bringing stuff with you when you move teams, I think it stopped then. Although 5 years later, I think it starts again. People forget about Spygate. But that was an incredible time. $100 million fine for McLaren was unprecedented. Most teams wouldn't survive that kind of fine. And I think it drew a very definite line in the sand of what was acceptable and what wasn't. And it was clear to every single person working in the sport that you're taking the team you work for now's data with you was not acceptable. I still got involved in cases later in my career.
And I think for that one, that the reason that it got found out was the wife of an engineer at McLaren was photocopying all the details. And the person who worked in the photocopy shop was a fan of the Ferrari Formula One team. So they emailed Stefano Domenicali and said, hey, this is going on. And that's the only reason it got found out, from what I understand.
Yeah, if they'd bought, a $100 photocopier machine, no one would ever have known, but took it down to a photocopy shop and said, hey, can you copy this 500-page document for me, which had Ferrari written all over it?
Funny.
Yeah.
So we needed Netflix 15 years before it actually came out, didn't we?
No.
Imagine some of the drama that would have appeared. And you're in the Netflix show, the first season, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm listening to Claire when she's talking to the team. I get 3 seconds of fame in the very first series.
Very cool. Let's switch gears and go for some relatively quick fire questions. The first question I've got for you is: do you have a favorite movie or TV car?
Oh, movie or TV car?
Or a car you'd like to own?
Oh, like to own is fairly easy. It's Bond's Aston Martin. I love Aston Martin. So yeah, I've actually seen the car. I had a couple of visits up to the Aston Martin factory. I knew the IT director up there, Simon, and we collaborated a few times. And I went up there. And they were doing a Bond special on the second visit I was there, and I got to see a few of the cars. So yeah, that DB5. In terms, for me, growing up, it was a Knight Rider. I don't know if you remember.
Of course.
I loved that car. I've seen the DeLorean as well from Back to the Future, or one of them. I know there were a number of them made for the movie, but one of them that was used in the movie. When I was in the US, one of the places I went into one of the museums and saw Batman's car as well. That was pretty cool. So yeah, there's lots of iconic cars, but yeah, for me, I think probably Kit from Knight Rider.
Yeah. Who is the best driver that you have worked with?
Fernando Alonso.
And any specific reason? Just his ability over everyone else, or?
By a country mile, he was the best. That's probably being unfair to one other driver that I was in a team with, in Kimi Räikkönen, who I think was also pretty special. But that was one season towards the end of his career or 1.5 seasons that I was with him. Yeah, Fernando he had everything. He has that X factor. It's funny that they were talking about it recently because he's obviously back in the sport, which I'm loving, which is why I'm wearing my Aston Martin shirt today. I've heard it described by various engineers who've worked with him that he can do complex calculus, maths calculations while he's driving the car. He's got extra brain capacity that's not being used while he's driving the car. He's that good. So in the last race that I saw him, he got a podium. There was a red flag, and he immediately came onto his engineer quoting some of the regulations about why he should be reinstated back up into third place. Anyway, yeah, he's absolutely incredible in what he can do. I mean, I've worked with drivers who use all of their brain power just to keep that car on the track. I remember watching an onboard once of a driver who was looking down at the steering wheel while they were pressing the buttons, and they had a crash. And it's just they were a bloody good driver, but I know Fernando just has that. And there's been many of them, Michael, but who I didn't work with, Senna and Prost and Lauda before that, and Lewis has it now, and I think Max has it. They just have that they've got so much extra brain that the driving piece is easy for them, whereas for most drivers, the driving piece consumes all of their attention.
Well, so Alonso, best car produced while you were at a team?
I'm going to go with the R26. So that's the 2006 Renault. I mean, closely followed by the R25, the 2005 one. 2005 because it was my first championship, and it's a beautiful car. But the 2006 car, beating Schumacher and Ferrari at their best, and it had those shark gills, and especially from the back when you look at that car, it's just a beautiful car. So either of them, but it's the 26 gets it.
With Zebedee.
Yes, yeah.
Favorite track to go visit?
Probably a cliche, but for me, Silverstone. You know, having seen Nigel win it all those years before when I lived in South Africa on TV, the first race I ever went to live was Silverstone. And I've never been to Silverstone and not been absolutely thrilled about the fact I was there. One of my worst experiences getting home was Silverstone. We were stuck 3 hours in the car park. One rainy, muddy one. I think it was the year that Michael broke his leg at Silverstone, and we spent 3 hours sitting in the car park, not moving. But yeah, I love Silverstone. The British fans are amazing.
Excellent. Favorite race weekend city?
So cities, there's a few. Melbourne is amazing. Montreal, loved Montreal. Budapest, my first race I went. Well, I didn't actually go to the race, as I mentioned. I dropped off a server and left. But actually, I think probably my favorite is Austin. For everything that happens around it, the fact that it's not like the rest of Texas, and actually you get a lot of passionate fans there. Yeah, Austin squeaks it.
They know how to put on a show for the whole weekend, don't they?
Absolutely.
And if you're ever in Austin, there is a very good dueling piano bar. I can highly recommend.
Dueling piano bar. Yeah, absolutely.
It's a very it's a stable location for the Sunday night, isn't it, for many of the teams? So that's the top tip if you go to the US Grand Prix.
Yeah, lots of the people you see in there in the evening will be F1 staff who are finally getting a chance to have a beer.
And wind down. Graeme, thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate it. Graeme, if people want to connect with you on any medias, how would they do so?
So the two I'm probably most active on, LinkedIn, Graeme Hackland on LinkedIn, and also Graeme Hackland on Twitter. It was very boring when I chose my names. That's probably the two I'm most active on.
Excellent. Well, you're probably early on Twitter then, if you got Graeme Hackland.
And there's less F1 chat now. There's more gaming chat, but that's a story for another day.
Excellent. Graeme, thanks for joining me today. Thank you for listening. This has been Danny P on Cars.
I would be nothing without you holding me up. Now I'm strong enough for both of us, both of us, both of us, both of us. I am a giant. Stand up on my shoulders. Tell me what you see. 'Cause I am